So welcome to our virtual Association of Jewish Libraries Research Archives and Special Collections Bibliography and Reference Award event. We are so glad for you to make it. For their continuing support and commitment to the AJL-RAS Bibliography and Reference Awards, the association recognizes and thanks Reference Award sponsor, Dr. Greta Silver of New York, and Bibliography this year's prize for bibliography to—
Brian, can I just ask you to, sorry, we missed, we froze just at that moment after who you were recognizing.
All right, I'll start from the top then at that part. Okay. For their continuing support and commitment to the AJL-RAS Bibliography and Reference Awards, the association recognizes and thanks Reference Award sponsor, Dr. Greta Silver of New York, and Bibliography Award sponsor, Mr. Eric Chaim Klein of Santa Monica, California. Thank you so much to you both. This year's prize for bibliography was awarded to Essays on the Making of the Early Hebrew Book by Marvin J. Heller. Mr. Heller's interest in books began early. As he tells it, my maternal grandparents lived in Williamsburg in Brooklyn, and we visited them weekly from the 1940s through the 1950s. My grandfather, to whom I was very close and admired greatly, would give my sister and me some change every visit, substantial to a little boy in the 1940s and 1950s. I would go immediately to the local used bookstore, not the normal expenditure for a small boy. One of the books I purchased, not yet read, and in my attic was Thomas Mann's Buten books. Although I have since read both his Joseph and his brothers and The Magic Mountain, as well as parts of Death in Venice. In Newark, I regularly visited the nearby local library, frequently going to the adult section to read books on history. Perchance I was a nerd. Mr. Heller goes on to relate what can only be described as an example of divine providence. When Feldheim closed its retail store in Manhattan, I regularly walked at lunchtime from the bank where I worked in Lower Manhattan to Feldheim's store on the Lower East Side, where they sold their stock of old and rare books at very discounted prices. Among the books that I purchased, and what seemed and was a steal at the time, were old Gemaras. I had just read an article by R.A. Kaplan describing purchases he had made at a used bookstore, including old Talmudic tractates. I saw that I could write a comparable article on the old tractates that I had purchased and began to write. Soon after beginning the article, I decided that an introduction was required and began to work on that. I completed the introduction, but the article remains undone. The introduction, which ended up being 450 pages long, was my first book called Printing the Talmud. I've continued to pursue the subject of early printing and am now the author of 8 books comprised of 3 volumes of the Printing of the Talmud series, 3 collections of articles, and 2 volumes describing books printed in the 16th and 17th centuries under the title An Abridged Thesaurus. Parenthetically, I am also the author of a collection of parodies of fairy tales, as yet unpublished, entitled Stories for Hanaleh, based on modifications of those tales which I used to read to my youngest daughter. Again, allow me to thank you very much for this Reference and Bibliography Award. Dov Cohen, whose work Thesaurus of the Ladino 1490 through 1960 Annotated Bibliography was awarded honorable mention, is a senior lecturer at the Tsevi Institute for Ladino Studies at Brill University. Previously, he was deputy director of the Tsevi Institute in Jerusalem. He has published several academic articles, and his research focuses on various aspects of Sephardic Jewry, including the history of Ladino books, Ladino periodicals, Sephardic genealogy, Hebrew paleography, and more. Elissa Bemporad is professor of history and Unger chair at Eastern European Jewish History and the Holocaust at Queens College and CUNY Graduate Center. She is a 2-time winner of the National Jewish Book Award. She is the author of Becoming Soviet Jews, The Bolshevik Experiment in Minsk, published by Indiana University Press in 2013, and Legacy of Blood, Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murder in the Lands of the Soviets, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. This is also the co-editor of 2 volumes, Women and Genocide, Survivors, Victims, and Perpetrators, which is IU Press 2018, and Pogroms, A Documentary History, Oxford University Press 2021. She's the editor of Jewish Social Studies and is currently working on a biography of Esther Frumkin. Eugene M. of Avrutin is the Tobor Family Endowed Professor of Modern European Jewish History at the University of Illinois Together, they edited this year's awardee for reference, Pogroms, A Documentary History. I now turn over the table to Elissa and Eugene for their book talk. Thank you very much. Okay, so Elissa and Eugene, you're up.
Should I go first?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So thank you so much for this introduction, and thank you to the Association of Jewish Libraries for this award. It is an honor to be here and also to say a few words about our book. This book, which, as you know, I co-edited it with my colleague Jean Avrutin, and you will hear from him in a few minutes, really chronicles through an original collection of archival and other primary sources, different waves of pogroms that took place over the course of some 6 decades, from the 1880s to the 1940s, and chronicles the ways in which Jewish communities of the eastern borderlands of Europe, primarily the so-called Pale of Settlement, experience the violence. And what we do in this book, we really try to focus on the why and the how. So why rioters attack Jews and Jewish property and cause physical harm, and how also they attack Jewish property and cause physical harm to Jewish men, women, and children. And but I think that what we do with this book is that we show how complicated the history of anti-Jewish violence is. It's a complicated history. It's made of destruction, but it's also made of coexistence. So I'm going to just make a few remarks about this volume, that I guess to tell you why I think this is an interesting volume. So first of all, I think that the selection of the sources that the authors put together allow the reader to capture the emotions, the emotional dimension of violence, right? The emotions experienced by the victims, witnessed by the bystanders, and the emotions that trigger the perpetrators, right? So the sources give us a sense of how this violence, which could be intimate, so it was carried out by neighbors against neighbors, or it's a violence that is carried out by strangers, in a way, by soldiers, but how this violence is enveloped in emotions. So emotions play a role in thrusting the event, right? There's an allure of violence, there's anger, envy, fear, anxiety, retaliation, rage, and whether the motivation for the violence is class-based and manifests itself through looting, or it is perpetrated because Jews are identified as a threat to national security and are identified as a vector for socialism or communism. So regardless of all this, the sources included in this volume really allow us to tap into the emotions that make up the material of the pogrom. So that's the first point that I wanted to raise. The second one, I think that by offering this kind of diachronic narrative of pogrom violence, the book gives the reader the framework to study and to understand pogrom violence comparatively. So what was different and what was similar in the events of 1881, 1882, compared to 1903, 1905, compared to 1914, 1921, compared to the 30s, the second part of the 1930s, or 1945, 1946. So I think that the sources included in this volume really allow the reader never to lose sight of the historical context and to root each wave of anti-Jewish violence into the specific context, a context of socioeconomic crisis or political turmoil, war, instability in the borderlands. And a diachronic reading is not, it's not teleological in any way, or at least the editors are clear about this. And hopefully the message in this book is also. So there's no suggestion here of a simplistic teleological interpretation of Jewish history, especially in Eastern Europe, as a progressive history of destruction that leads inevitably to the Holocaust. The hope is that by really zooming in on the context, we are able to better understand when, why, and how a pogrom, anti-Jewish violence is unleashed, and also so really walking this fine line between rejecting a deterministic teleology of Jewish history, but at the same time acknowledging how layers of violence and cultures of violence play out in Jewish history. My third point, I only have 4 points, so I'm almost there. My third point is that the study of modern ethnic violence that targets Jews, I think, is a window into understanding what happened to other minority groups. So we hope that this volume can open up new avenues to think about and to investigate structural similarities between anti-Jewish violence and violence against other minority groups, other subaltern groups, and other contexts. So it is a useful source for anyone interested in modern ethnic violence. For example, to think about the role of the state as incubator of violence, the modern nation state project, to better understand, the role of state authorities in the violence. Does violence grow out of the presence of a strong state or out of the weakness or the absence of the state? For me, again, thinking comparatively, the pogroms of 1881, 1882, and 1905 can and should be studied through the sources we include in this text in conversation with instances of ethnic violence, for example, against the Armenian minority in late Ottoman Empire in the 1890s, or anti-Jewish violence of the 1930s in independent Poland can and should be studied vis-a-vis acts of violence perpetrated against the Ukrainian minority in independent Poland. And anti-Jewish violence during the Russian Civil War can and should be compared to anti-Black violence perpetrated at the same time in the US. So for example, the 1921 Tulsa massacre and the destruction of the so-called Black Wall Street. So we don't really zoom into these aspects, but we hope that other students and scholars of modern ethnic violence would use this text to think comparatively about other instances of ethnic violence. And finally, my last point has to do with gender, and I think that working on this book has reminded me once again of how much we can learn more about a specific phenomenon in history if we include the focus on women and gender. And this also applies to pogrom violence, which is something that I think is addressed extensively in this volume and several of the different chapters. So, for example, the focus, my chapter specifically, the focus on the female dimension of pogrom violence, but also in other chapters, how the experience of women and girls during pogrom violence was different compared to the experience of men during the pogroms of the Civil War. And of course, there's the question of rape and sexual violence. And the way in which we can use the pogroms of the Civil War, for example, to measure the mass brutalization that takes place during the 20th century, marked by the beginning of World War I. And we see how sexual violence against Jewish women and girls moves from, in a way, the periphery of the pogrom from the late 19th century to the center of the pogrom and becomes more and more widespread. And is used as an instrument of ethnic cleansing. Now, the focus on women, of course, also helps us rethink the category of victim, right? We tend to assume a complete powerlessness, especially of Jewish women. In fact, it is much more complicated, and women participated in self-defense units. During the pogroms, they served as medical workers, but also as writers and chroniclers of violence, something that is not, I think, sometimes we forget when we study anti-Jewish violence. And also another interesting aspect of women is that women can also become agents of violence, right? With instances in which non-Jewish women are eager to seize the property of their neighbors targeted for violence, just like white women during lynching of Black men, and in this country, participated in the violence as agents of violence. Also was very interesting for me to find out that Jewish women, although it is rare, but become agents of violence. So, for example, in the chaos of the pogroms of the Russian Civil War, we do have, in some rare instances, Jewish women who side with the perpetrators, right, and not with the victims, because it's class allegiance that prevails in a way compared to the allegiance to the same ethnic group of belonging. So that by focusing on women, we can in a way revisit the commonly expected or assumed polarization of Jewish victimhood and non-Jewish perpetrators. Of course, it's uncomfortable to think about victims behaving or taking the side of a perpetrator. And again, it's on the margins, but it still, I think, is important in order to fully grasp all the dimensions of pogrom violence. And I think that our volume does a pretty good job in trying really to grasp and convey the many dimensions of pogroms violence. So let me stop here and turn it over to Gene.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, I also want to say thank you to the association for the award. It's humbling, and it's a pleasure to win it. Obviously, it was a real pleasure to work with Elissa and a distinguished roster of contributors. Some of the the most qualified and the most experienced historians working out there on pogroms, as well as Oxford University Press. I think the book, the publisher did a beautiful job with the book. It's oversized, so it's not a small volume, but it's an oversized volume, and it's very easy to read. So that's a good thing, right? With high quality pages. The book itself is part of a larger cluster of volumes or documentary histories on important dimensions in Jewish studies, which have been recently published. And I think it's important to say that at the outset. We all know of the Jew in the Modern World, now in its third edition, also published by Oxford. It's a hefty volume. It's a comprehensive history. But there are other recent volumes which have come out in the last few years. And I just want to mention a few of these. Tony Michael's book, Radicalism in American Jewish History, Cohen and Stein's Sephardi Lives, Baum's and Stein's Wartime North Africa, which I think just recently came out with Stanford. And of course, Sharon Fries's Everyday Jewish Life in Imperial Russia, which is a very thick book, but which only touches on pogroms tangentially. So all of these books are coming out at a kind of a particular moment. Not all of them are organized and structured the same way, these documentary histories, but our book, as do these volumes, reflect a certain historiographic maturity, if you will. That is, the book's synthesizes a rich secondary literature. In our case, our subfield has developed since around the 1980s and has shown no signs of stopping, particularly the recent interesting work around the Civil War period, including Elissa's terrific book. So this is, our volume kind of speaks to these to this trend to this outpouring of scholarship. Our volume provides students and the general reader a history of pogroms, beginning with the riots of the 1880s in the Russian Empire, moving on to Habsburg Galicia, chapters on Kishinev, 1905, World War I, as well as 3 chapters on the Civil War pogroms. So we treat the Civil War pogroms in a very kind of multi-dimensional aspect, and concluding in the interwar period, Poland. Excuse me. So I think just to underline what Elissa has already mentioned, we have no interest in showing a kind of teleological progression of violence, although the violence did build on itself, and there is a kind of ritualistic kind of aspects of it, which we talk about in some detail, as do the authors. But nevertheless, I think chronology is important here, and the volume certainly does that. It provides, the chapters, the documents are introduced by a scholarly essay. It's so that each chapter is around 10,000 words, no more than 10,000 words. But each chapter, all the documents are introduced by a scholarly essay of around 2,000 words. So this little introduction by the scholar adds context, explanation, analysis to the chapters. So they're not just documents. We have lots of explanation, and we have lots of analysis by different scholars. So the documents include eyewitness testimony, oral histories, diary experts, literary works, trial records, lots of press coverage in different languages, memos, and field reports by a wide range of historical actors. So one of the things, and Elissa already mentioned this, is that we really try to give ordinary people, lots of voices, lots of chance to speak to the reader. And I think the documents do a really great job of this. The themes students are able to explore include how ordinary people experience the brutalization campaigns at the local level, the ways in which these brutalization campaigns intensified and the reasons why, the symbolic and ritual dimensions of violence, including mass rape, which these sensitive topics certainly appear in these documents, the interplay of racial ideology and anti-Semitism, the dynamics already alluded to of gender and violence, and the multi kind of directional engagement of diverse historical actors, including poets, writers, statisticians, journalists with the destructive impulses of violence. So we have lots of different voices coming in. And I think that the book can be taught in a number of different ways. It could be a straight up kind of a pogroms seminar, which I will be offering next academic year. That is a chance to allow students really to engage with the sources, to write primary essays or essays based on primary documents, which are not easily or readily available to these undergraduate students who sometimes do not read, multiple languages, but may very well do so, and if they go on to graduate school. But it also could be taught in a variety of different other types of classes, right? Comparative classes, comparative racism, anti-Semitism classes, classes that have to deal with genocidal and ethnic violence, I just lost my document. It really invites comparisons, right, with other episodes of genocide and crimes against humanity around the world. And I think for the first time, so one of the things that I think that students can really do is that they could really dive deeply, as Elissa already points out, into these kinds of comparisons with other places and other episodes around the world. So students, for example, in Illinois who are from Chicago and may be familiar with the race riots and could even go up to Chicago and do some research on their own on the race riots, are probably going to be interested in this volume. And so we have, for example, we offer small scholarships, small stipends for students to do this kind of work, and they may, go out to the Center of Jewish History and do more interesting archival research. So this is what we hope, that these are our dreams for this book, and hopefully that would be the case. And it's great that it's receiving coverage. And I hope that, that it gets assigned quite a bit in the years to come. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Gene and Elissa, for a wonderful book talk. It's a remarkable book. It's when we were reviewing it, we really thought highly. Before we begin for questions, I'd like to just also thank the committee that awarded the books, which included Diane Mizrahi, Sharon Benamu, and Daniel Kestenbaum, and chaired by Anna Levia. And thank you very much. It was a great committee to be part of. We can open up the floor to questions to Elissa and to Gene, if you have. I can put them in the chat, or you could just unmute yourself and speak into the mic. We actually have about a half hour. Actually, very good.
I see. Well, first of all, I think I guess I'll jump in, and I want to thank. I also want to thank the judges on the committee for selecting our book. I see about Jeff Beidlinger's book. Jeff, by the way, is also one of the contributors. He has one of the chapters on the Civil War in our volume, and the archival materials, how it is phrased here, drawing on archival materials, including thousands of newly discovered witness testimonies, trial records, and official orders. Yes, these are documents that I have also used. These are all documents that have been at YIVO in the Cherikover collection. And I see here my friend, if I may say friend, Zachary Baker, who certainly knows this collection quite well. So these are materials that have been there for a very long time, and that have been used by several scholars, including myself. I think that Weidlinger's book, because of, has perhaps managed to reach a wider readership. But these documents, have been there, available in the Cherikover archive of YIVO for a long period of time. And these are very powerful documents, witness accounts. I think that what is interesting is that some of the scholars who have, I think, returned or revisited this chapter that has mostly been forgotten of anti-Jewish violence, namely the pogroms of the Civil War, have also been, in a way, inspired, I guess, by this turn in the historiography about witness accounts, right? If we think about what Annette Weviorka wrote in The Era of the Witness, right? How the voice of the witness is no longer dismissed by the historian, as was previously the case, both in Holocaust studies and genocide study, but in general in the study of violence, because violence is so traumatic. So how can we believe the voices of the witness? But so many of us have returned to these sources, but these sources have always been there. And I've used these sources, for my book that came out in 2019. So I hope that answers your question.
And I see Cheryl has her hand up. Cheryl, you want to ask your question?
Hi, sorry. Thank you so much for your presentation and for the book. I have sort of a reality check on my family history type of question. My family came over mostly from Habsburg, Galicia, between 1900 and 1909. Sorry. And the story had been that, the reason our family wasn't killed in the Holocaust was because we fled from the pogroms. But it seems like the timing doesn't quite work out. It seems like it was more in the 1880s and then a little bit of a jump to the 19-teens. So was there a big push right around 1900? Were things going on then, or is it sort of a delayed reaction?
Jean, maybe you want to?
Sure, I could say a few words. I mean, one of the things, one of the reasons why we wanted to get a book out for an audience to synthesize so much of the scholarly materials that is not readily available, right? Both kind of interpretive and documentary, and specifically to an undergraduate audience, and also to a wider kind of reading, community of readers, is precisely because the pogroms, more than anything else really about Eastern European Jewish life, have produced a number of misinterpretations, myths, ideas that are not quite there. They might be there, but then again, they probably have some kind of holes in the arguments. And so, so one of the important, I guess, aspects of this anti-Jewish violence, that it's tied around issues of migration, of movement, specifically towards North America, of how they affected Jewish life on the ground. And so it has always been kind of a more complicated answer about why so many Jews packed up and left, right? And it's not only related to pogrom violence, it certainly has something to do with it. But the issues of movement are extremely complicated because Jews not only moved overseas, but they also moved internally. Specifically during the Civil War is when the Pale of Settlement was abolished, and there's lots of movement into the interior of the Soviet Union as well. So yeah, I mean, so that's kind of on the kind of larger conceptual arena, but maybe Elissa, you would like to speak to other aspects as well.
No, I don't really have much to add to what to what you said, Jean. I mean, I think that I think that if we were to take this book and look at the theme of migration, we would, as a reader, we would appreciate again how complicated this question is, meaning that why what triggers migration? It's not only violence. There are also other other aspects, and there's been primarily a focus again on certain regions and certain areas of the Pale of Settlement, and other areas have not really been covered sufficiently. So, there is much more work that can be done, just to connect it to the personal story that you just mentioned, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. let's see, any other questions and comments? And if anybody else wants to add, I think, no, actually, we don't. So it's all lucky, all quiet here on the Zoom and on the Western Front. So let me just thank both Jean and Elissa for the wonderful book talk and the committee for awarding. And I wish everybody a wonderful afternoon or morning, whichever part of the world you're in, or evening too. So anyways, thank you very much. And also wish everybody a Shana Tova as well, coming up in 2 weeks. So
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank
our
you.
pleasure. Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.